One of my favorite Muhammad Ali stories is a story about a time he was flying somewhere, and the pilot came over the loudspeaker and said, would all passengers please fasten their seatbelts because we're getting ready to experience some turbulence. And so the flight attendants were walking up and down the aisle checking to see if people had fastened their seatbelts, and the flight attendant came up to Muhammad Ali and noticed that he hadn't fastened his seatbelt. And so she looked at him and said, "Sir, would you please fasten your seatbelt?" And he looked back at her in typical Muhammad Ali fashion and said, "Superman don't need no seatbelt." And she looked at him just as quickly and said, "Superman don't need no airplane either. Fasten your seatbelt." I love that story for a whole host of reasons, but the primary reason is this, that if life teaches us anything at all, it teaches us that none of us are supermen. We are all broken people living in a broken world with other broken people. All of us. As I mentioned at the beginning, one of my favorite lines comes from a now deceased Presbyterian pastor named Jack Miller, who said, "Cheer up, you're a lot worse off than you think you are, but God's grace is infinitely greater than anything you could ever hope for or imagine." Some of you may know this, and some of you may not, but I used to be a successful pastor. I was leading a large, famous church in Fort Lauderdale. I was writing a book a year. My sermons were broadcast on TV around the world every week. They were on the radio every day. I was traveling all over the country, speaking at conferences and churches and other events. I mean, according to the world standards, I had everything. I had a great family heritage. I had a successful career. I had notoriety and influence and financial security. I had a good reputation. Opportunities seemed endless. My life was on a great trajectory professionally. And then it all came crashing down. Two things that I thought I'd never lose were my marriage and my career, and I lost both 7 years ago due to my own sin and selfishness. My first marriage ended in part because I was unfaithful to my wife and therefore deserved to lose both the marriage and the ministry God had given me. And because in the Christian world I was a public person, I lost it all very, very publicly. My worst season in life was being broadcast further and wider than anything else I'd ever done. But with those two losses, the loss of my first marriage and the loss of my ministry, with those two losses came 1,000 other losses. I lost friendships, the loss of my family unit as it was constructed. I have 3 children, Gabe, Nate, and Jenna, and although they were all older at the time that this happened, it was still crushing to my children. So I lost friendships, I lost my family, I lost purpose, I lost credibility, I lost financial stability, I lost hope, I lost joy, I lost opportunity, I lost life as I knew it. I went from living the dream to living the nightmare. In one fell swoop, everything I had was gone. Gone. I was 42, just about to turn 43 at the time. I broke my own life. I broke my own family. I broke the hearts of people who loved and trusted me. And I wanted to die. Literally, wanted to die. I've never been suicidal a day in my life. In fact, my mom nicknamed me, I'm the middle of 7 children, and my mom nicknamed me Sunshine when I was a little boy. It doesn't sound very masculine or cool. But she said every time you walked in a room, everything would get brighter. Even as a little kid, I loved the sights and sounds and smells of life. I've always been an extrovert. I've always been a people person. I've always loved the little details of this world. But now my life felt very dark. There was no sunshine peering through the dark clouds of my life at that time. And because of that, I literally thought that death was preferable to life, I keep on my phone a suicide note that I wrote in the beginning of July of 2016. A little over a year after I crashed and burned, and I couldn't see any light at the end of the tunnel. And I was absolutely convinced that my best days were behind me, that I would never be happy again, that I would never experience joy again, that I would never have the energy for life that I used to have, that I would never enjoy the things that I used to enjoy, ever. I was convinced that life was over. I felt dead, therefore I may as well be dead. That was my thinking at the time. I didn't realize it at the time, but my value, in fact, let me preface this by saying this. We typically don't know how deeply we depend on things to make life worth living until those things are gone. That's when we discover that we've been depending on something smaller than God to invest our lives with meaning and purpose and value and significance and safety and all that stuff. And you typically don't know what those things are until you lose them or until they're gone. And I didn't realize it at the time, but my value, my security, my deepest sense of who I was, my identity, was anchored to things like my success, my reputation, my position, my friends, the praise I received, the admiration that I received, the opportunities that I had, and so on and so forth. And because my identity, my worth, my value, my significance was all tied to those things, when those things were gone, I didn't just suffer grief and pain and shame and regret. I began suffering a severe identity crisis. My identity was so tethered to those things that losing them all forced me in my early 40s to wonder who I was. A scary place to be, as some of you know. Without these things and without these people that I had depended on to make me feel valuable and important, I no longer knew who I was. I felt dead, therefore I may as well be dead. When I was at rock bottom, really, I thought I had hit rock bottom a handful of times, and there's always a lower bottom. But to me, this really seemed like rock bottom. I mean, I had just finished writing a suicide note. I was ready to call it quits. And I don't know if any of you have ever had serious suicidal thoughts, but what I experienced, I had only heard before that this was true, but I experienced it myself, is when you make the decision that you're gonna do it, gosh, there's immediate relief. Immediate relief. Because in your mind, you're like, okay, the end is coming and this pain will soon be over. The dread will soon be gone. I won't have to deal with this anymore. And when I was at that bottom, I sent a text to a friend of mine named Paul Zoll, who's a retired Episcopalian priest and probably the smartest and wisest man that I know. And he was with me at the very beginning. He was with me when I was at the top, and he was with me when I was at the bottom. And he walked me through the valley of the shadow of death on numerous occasions. Let me say this, first of all. It is almost impossible to know who your friends are when you're at the top. Impossible. Because you have so much to offer when life is going well, and when you have so much to offer, when you can help people, when you are a benefit to others. It's hard to know who your friends are when you're at the top, but when you're at the bottom, and all you have to offer the people around you is liability and leprosy, you discover pretty quickly who your friends are. And while sadly I discovered that I didn't have nearly as many friends as I thought I had a network, I had acquaintances, I had colleagues, but I didn't have a whole lot of friends. Paul was a friend. He walked with me. He knows the details of that season in my life like almost no one else does. He knows the good, the bad, and the ugly. He knew when I was lying to him, when I was still, my reputation was crap at the time. And I was still trying to polish what little I had left before my friend Paul, who knew I was lying, he knew it. And he didn't rebuke me. He said, he understands the human condition well enough. He has in sociological terms, he has a very low anthropology, okay? In other words, he didn't expect sinners to be anything more than sinners. So when I would lie to him, he'd be like, of course. I mean, that's what liars do. They lie. When I was trying to manufacture my image back so I could get my old life back, he knew what I was trying to do, and he loved me anyway. And so I texted him on this day, and I just basically sent this desperation text saying, give me a reason to live. I don't remember exactly what I said, but that was the gist of it. And normally he would write back something very quickly. And on this particular occasion, he didn't respond for a couple hours. And I'm thinking, dude, did he bail too? I was so used to people who I thought were my friends walking away from me because I was messy. And I thought, no, God, I pray that Paul didn't walk away too. But a few hours later, he responded. And his response to my text turned the tide for me. Later, he said the reason that he took so long to respond was because he knew the question was probably the weightiest question I'd ever asked. And he wanted to take his time to think and pray about how to specifically respond. And I don't believe that Paul's words were inspired by God in the same way that I believe that the Apostle Paul's words were inspired by God, but it's pretty damn close, okay? And this is what he said to me. The purpose behind the suffering you are going through is to push you into a new freedom from false definitions of who you are. Wow. That's all he said. Okay, now, I want to camp there for a minute, okay? Every word was chosen carefully. Every word. He is a wordsmith. He's brilliant. Harvard trained, brilliant. He chose every word very intentionally and very carefully, just by saying the purpose behind. That was what I was struggling with. I wasn't confused about why I was suffering and undergoing all of the deconstruction that I was undergoing. I screwed up, and I was understandably paying the consequences for it. I wasn't confused about that. And wherever I would turn, there was some Christian reminding me that the reason I was suffering was because I screwed up. Okay? Paul's words were very different. What I couldn't see was whether or not there was any purpose behind it. What was the purpose? So he started there. The purpose behind the suffering. Now, he chose the word suffering intentionally. You see, I'm convinced that the church does a pretty good job of dealing with people who are suffering because of what someone has done to them. I am equally convinced that the church has done an incredibly crappy job of dealing with people who are suffering because of what they've done to themselves or because of what they've done to somebody else. And while the person who is suffering because of what someone has done to them and the person who is suffering because of what they've done to themselves and to other people, while those two streams of suffering may be different, both of them are suffering. And you guys know this to be true. The guilt and the shame and the regret and the weightiness of loss that you experience when you screw up. And you hurt yourself and you hurt people you love, and you have to look in the eyes of your kids or look in the eyes of your wife, or you have to look in the eyes of a friend or someone and tell them that you betrayed them because you were selfish. There's a suffering that accompanies that, okay? So he chose the word suffering very intentionally. The purpose behind the suffering you are experiencing, because up until that point, except for Paul, a lot of the people were saying, well, you're suffering, you deserve it. Everything you're going through, you deserve. Everything. And you're probably going to get more and more of it, which at that point I thought was probably true. But Paul wanted me to know that, listen, there is a sufferer who is suffering because of what they've done to someone else or because of what they've done to themselves is still suffering and is still in need of God's grace. It's not that justice is for the one and grace is for the other. The person who is suffering because of what's been done to them needs the grace of God. And the person who is suffering because of what they've done to someone else needs the grace of God. Jesus died for both. So he said, the purpose behind the suffering you are going through is to push you, kick you into a new freedom from false definitions of who you are. You see, he had walked with me long enough to know that the root of my suffering was this identity crisis. I had so located my value and worth and the people that were my friends and the things that I had accomplished and the opportunities that I had and all of that stuff, that when that stuff was gone and I didn't want to live anymore, I didn't want to live. Paul very rightly pointed out there's a reason for that. It's because unwittingly, unbeknownst to you, you attached your identity to those things. Your roles became your identity. And you know that if your role becomes your identity, every time your role changes, you go through an identity crisis. Every time. So let me say this. I don't know what you're going through or what you're currently losing. I don't know what your shattered dreams are. I don't know what you've suffered or what you're guilty of doing. I don't know your deepest fears. I don't know your insecurities. I don't know your secrets. And I don't know your shame. But what I do know is this. Who you truly are has nothing to do with you. Nothing. How much you can accomplish, what you can become, whether or not you can kick the addiction, what you've done or failed to do, how smart you are, what other people think of you, your behavior, good or bad, your strengths, your weaknesses, your family background, your education, how your kids turn out, the way you look, and so on and so forth. Who you ultimately are, who you truly are, has nothing to do with you. Your identity, who you truly are, who you ultimately are, is anchored in Jesus' accomplishment, not yours. His strength, not yours. His performance, not yours. In other words, you are not what you do. You are what Jesus has done for you. That is your identity. And that's good news, okay? And I'll give you a couple of reasons why that's good news. It's good news because if God's love and acceptance of me is based on what I do or don't do, I'm screwed. We all are. I could bring up a whole host of people on this stage to verify what I'm about to tell you. I am not the Christian that I ought to be, nor am I the father or friend or husband that I should be. For instance, I wish that I could say, I do everything for God's glory. You know, 1 Corinthians 10:31, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all to the glory of God. Now let's think about that for a second, okay? Does that sound like good news to you? Okay? Whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all, not some, not partially, do it all to the glory of God. Now, I wish that I could say I do everything for God's glory. I can't, and neither can you. What I can say is that Jesus' blood covers all of my efforts to glorify myself. That's the gospel. I wish that I could say, Jesus fully satisfies me. I can't. Either can you. What I can say is that Jesus fully satisfied God for me. That's the gospel. I wish that I could say, I surrender all to Jesus. I can't. No one can. What I can say is Jesus surrendered all for me. The gospel is not you and your transformation, okay? In a lot of Christian communities and churches, that's how the gospel is peddled, that the focus of the Christian faith is the life of the Christian. That it took God's blood, sweat, and tears to get you in, but now it takes your blood, sweat, and tears to keep you in. That you needed Jesus a lot at the beginning, but as you grow and mature and become stronger and stronger and more competent, you need him less and less. We were talking about this in here on Wednesday night. And I said, typically when we think about growth, spiritual growth, we think about it like this. I'm getting stronger and stronger and more competent every day. But that's not the way the Bible describes spiritual growth. I don't have time to go into this in a lot of detail, but do yourself a favor and just go back and read Philippians chapter 3, where Paul presents his very impressive religious resume. And he gets through it all and then says, it was all worthless compared to knowing Jesus and being found by Jesus. So spiritual growth is not, I'm getting stronger and stronger and more competent every day. Spiritual growth is, I'm becoming increasingly aware of how weak and incompetent I am and how strong and competent Jesus is and continues to be for me. Okay, that's Christianity. The gospel is not, I will courageously die for Jesus. The good news of the gospel is that Jesus courageously died for me. Okay? That's the gospel. So, I have finally arrived at the very freeing place of admitting that my life doesn't look like Jesus. My life looks like someone who needs Jesus. And that is the only kind of life that glorifies God. I remember hearing a preacher years ago when I was in college say this: how do you glorify a water fountain? You show up thirsty and drink. That's it. So if you think that bringing glory to God means that you have to clean yourself up to the point where you become the kind of person Jesus didn't even have to die for, that's not glorifying to God. Okay? Come ye sinners, weak and weary, lost and ruined by the fall. If you tarry till you're better, you will never come at all. So I've arrived at this very freeing place. Failure gives you a self-awareness that success doesn't. My successes connected me to a lot of people, but my failures have connected me with people in ways that my successes never did. I'm not here today because in my darkest moments I held on to God. And don't let the church tell you that real men hang on to God. Real men admit that they don't hang on to God, okay? I'm not here today because in my darkest moments I held on to God. No, I'm here today for one reason. And that's because in my darkest moments, God held on to me. I have let go of God 10,000 times. And I'm not finished. I'll let go of him tomorrow, and I'll let go of him the next day. And I'm not excusing it, I'm acknowledging it. There's no excuse for that. Jesus says, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. There's no excuse for imperfection. We say things like, well, I'm not perfect, as if that's okay. No, that's what God requires. Perfection. It's not try hard, do your best, it's be perfect. Well, once we hear that for what it really says, then we realize we can't do it. And that's when God says, gosh, I was waiting for you to get to that point. I know, Jesus did it for you. That's the whole freaking point. It's the whole point. Even when we are faithless, he is faithful. What do we sing? What has the church been singing for hundreds of years? Great is my faithfulness. Great is my faithfulness. No. Christianity is not great as my faithfulness. Christianity is great as thy faithfulness. In the face of my badness, you're nothing but good. Nothing but good. Sadly, most people think that Christianity is a vehicle for good behavior and clean living. Christianity is a good, God-given self-help tool to clear out all the bad behavior and make you good little boys. That's what it's for. That's what a lot of people think. But it's not. Christianity is the only remedy for those who have failed over and over and over and over again. That's what it is. Okay, it's not a vehicle for good behavior and clean living. It is the only solution to those who fail over and over and over again. Over and over and over again. So take heart. God only loves bad and weak people who fail because there aren't any other kinds of people. Okay? I mean, he only loves and uses weak people who screw up. He only gives grace to sinners. He only gives grace to sinners. Now, some of you will say, okay, hold on. The Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 6, okay, I know, because I've been around you guys, and I know there's always that little sort of moralistic, but I got to know what to do. And we shouldn't take advantage of grace. First of all, you do every day. You're taking advantage of his grace right now by breathing, okay? So people bring up Romans chapter 6 after Paul has waxed eloquent about the gospel in Romans 4 and 5 and talked about the radicality of the gospel and the good news that because of Jesus, God's love for us is firmly attached, that there's nothing we can do or fail to do that will cause God to leave us or forsake us. And then he anticipates his question at the beginning of Romans 6. So let me get this straight. Paul, are you saying that we should sin more so that grace may abound? And what does Paul say? Of course not. But then he does something remarkable. Rather than pulling back on grace, he pushes it in deeper. And he essentially says, if that's the first question that comes to mind after everything I just said, that doesn't mean that you get grace too much. It means you get it too little. So I got to push it in deeper. Because the heart that has been gripped and grasped and arrested by the grace of God doesn't ask questions like that. Rather, it says things like, take my life and let it be consecrated, Lord, to thee. Take my moments and my days, let them flow in ceaseless praise. I've never in my life met anybody who has been so gripped and so grasped by God's unconditional love for them and his grace for them that their first instinct is to want to go out and sin more. Ever. Ever. It's a caricature. That person doesn't exist. They don't exist. In fact, the very fact that they want to go out and sin more proves that they don't get grace enough. I mean, think about this for a second, okay? I'm married to my wife, Stacy. We've been married for 5.5 years. This August will be 6 years. She, along with Paul's all, were God's tools to save my life. And I'll come home from time to time, very rarely, but from time to time, in a bad mood, okay? Maybe something happened during the day or whatever. and I had a hard conversation, or somebody annoyed me, or the drivers in Jupiter are all old and slow and I was upset. I don't know. So, it doesn't take a whole lot, you know? Now, if I walk in the door and I'm being short and snippy with my wife, and in response to my shortness and snippiness, she puts her hands on my cheeks and looks at me and smiles and says, honey, I don't know what happened to you today. I just want you to know that I love you no matter what. Is that going to make me want to continue being a jerk to her? Of course not. I'm going to be like, oh my gosh, honey, I'm sorry. It's going to make me feel terrible for being a jerk to her. I'm going to say I'm sorry and ask for her forgiveness, and my attitude's going to change. Well, if that's true with regard to other people, why do we think it's different with God? When God looks at us at our worst and says, I love you anyway. You've gone to the same dry cistern 10 trillion times, and you keep going back, and you know what? I love you anyway. That doesn't make you want to sin more. It makes you feel bad and makes you want to stop. So take heart. God only loves bad people, because bad people are all there are. You know, when Jesus says, I've not come for the righteous, but the sinner. He wasn't saying, listen, there are two kinds of people in this world. There are good people who don't need me, and there are bad people who do. I didn't come for the good people who don't need me. I came for the bad people who do. It's not what he's saying. What he was saying was, there are two kinds of people in this world. There are bad people who think they're good, and there are bad people who know they're bad, okay? I've come for the bad person who knows they're bad, because the bad person who thinks they're good is never going to listen to a word I say. They're not desperate enough. They haven't been given the gift of desperation. Because of my story, I'm very open about it. I write about it. I talk about it. I'm uncomfortably transparent about it. Because of that, most of the people I meet these days are people like me. People who live with guilt and shame and regret because of what they've done. People who would do anything to go back in time and make different choices, but are plagued knowing that they can't. I know that a lot of you guys know how that feels. People who fear that they will never hope again. People who endure the painful void of broken relationships. People who struggle with believing that anybody, even God, could love them because they've screwed up so many times. Those are the kinds of people I mingle with mostly these days. And one thing stands out about all their stories, even though the details of their stories may be different, one thing stands out about all their stories. The Christian community is all too often the scariest place rather than the safest place for fallen people to fall down and broken people to break down. So I'm absolutely convinced that churches that will thrive in any meaningful way going forward will not be castles of purity where only the morally fit feel comfortable. Rather, they will be basements of grace where broken sinners are embraced and forgiven. Places where sin does not shock and grace still amazes. Because I'm telling you right now, I'm telling you, God is not looking for another Photoshop church with another Photoshop pastor. He's not looking for that. People see right through Christians who deny the dark reality of their own struggle and who see themselves as examples of morality rather than trophies of grace. People are craving realness and authenticity and transparency and honesty and the courage to acknowledge the truth about themselves. And how God's grace meets us in the dark corners of our lives. Those places in our lives that most people run away from are those same places that God runs toward. We tend to think that those who are in recovery programs are weak, and those who aren't are strong. After all, we haven't succumbed to the destructive demon of addiction like they have. But that's a lie. The truth is, we are all in recovery. We all have unhealthy relationships with something we depend on to soothe the pain. All of us. to make us feel strong, to make us feel secure, to make us feel safe, to make us feel important, to make us feel loved, to make us feel like we're in control. So your addiction may not be alcohol, but it may be getting approval. Okay, your addiction may not be getting high, but it may be getting attention or respect. It may not be sex, but it may be financial security. It may not be food, but it may be success. It may not be nicotine, but it may be health and fitness. I mean, we are all in recovery, all of us. If you're a human being, you're in recovery. And that means that there are two types of people in this world. People in recovery who know they are, and people in recovery who think they aren't. But there's no one who is not in recovery. And one thing this means is that it's not enough for local churches to have recovery ministries. As admirable as that may be, the church must begin to see itself as a recovery ministry. So I told our people a couple weeks ago, we have different recovery groups that meet here during the week. So grateful that they do. But I told our people, I said, our biggest recovery group happens in here every Sunday morning at 10:30 a.m. because we're all in it. And if the church doesn't begin to see itself as a recovery ministry, it will continue to fail in connecting the deep realities of God's amazing grace to the dark regions of human need. So when you know that God loves you unconditionally because of what Jesus has done for you, it sets you free from needing everybody else to like you. And you can begin telling the truth about yourself. I want to close with this. I want to read you something that I wrote last fall and that I read a couple weeks ago on Sunday morning. This tattoo down my left forearm has been here for a while. It's Greek for "it is finished," which is the final words that Jesus spoke on the cross. If you are a Christian, you live your life under a banner that reads, "It is finished." "It is finished" aren't just three words that were spoken 2,000 years ago by Jesus on the cross. They have present power. They're not just stating a fact. They are an unleashing of present power. And I want to give you an example. And we have this list printed out for all of you on the welcome table. You can take one as you go. Because it is finished, you are free from the impossible burden of having to earn God's love and acceptance. Because it is finished, there is nothing you can do or fail to do that will tempt God to leave you, forsake you, or stop loving you. Because it is finished, you cannot sin beyond the coverage of God's forgiveness. Because it is finished, the sins you can't forget, God chooses not to remember. Because it is finished, you are not defined by your worst moments or your greatest accomplishments, your struggles or your successes, your strengths or your weaknesses. You are defined by who you belong to. Because it is finished, you can talk truthfully about the worst parts of you without fear. Because the only person's approval that ultimately matters is God's, and you already have it. That's massive, man. Because it is finished, you can endure rejection from others because you will never have to endure rejection from God. And His acceptance is the only one that ultimately matters. And you already have it. Because it is finished, you can freely admit when you are wrong. Because your value is not dependent on being right, but rather on the righteousness of Christ that clothes you like a straitjacket. You are clothed in an irremovable suit of righteousness. There's nothing you can do about it. Because it is finished, God loves you unconditionally. I said this a minute ago. And that means you are free from needing everybody else to like you. Because it is finished, you can love others without needing them to love you back, because all of the love you need, you already have. Because it is finished, we can join our voices with the song of heaven in Revelation 5 and say, we are not worthy, but the Lamb who was slain is worthy, and by the grace of his saving death, we are what we are, beloved sons and daughters of God. Let's pray together.